After the Zelensky-Trump meeting, today's US relationship with both NATO and EU is strained. Right now, Europe is protected by NATO's Article 5. The US is obliged to help out the EU militarily if another country attacks it. But in reality, there may be specific situations where NATO's help might not be enough. Here's one, not so hard to imagine. Say the US doesn't want to send troops to Ukraine as part of its peacekeeping forces. Sounds familiar? Say that various EU countries do decide to send forces. Say that there's also an air policing component, which in reality was proposed by Britain. And let's say tens of thousands of EU troops are placed near the front lines in Ukraine. They don't even need to be right at the front line in no man's land. What happens if there are skirmishes between Russian and Ukrainian forces at parts of the front, even after a peace deal is put in place? Two sides can blame each other, and it's not even that important whose confused grunt started it, if it manages to blow up into a wider skirmish involving whole battalions. EU forces would need to move in and go in between the two warring sides. Otherwise, why are they even in Ukraine? Likewise, in the air, both sides might resort to sending some planes to aid their troops on the ground. At some point, European fighter jets might find themselves overflying a battlefront where enemy SAM systems are present. There may be a situation where it's not always super clear to all the Russian low-level units, or even Ukrainian ones, whose troops are those that they see at 2 miles out through an imperfect sensor near other troops which are firing on their own soldiers, or whose plane is that near other planes that are bombing Allied troops. And there may very easily be incidents where EU troops are fired upon, killed, where fighter jets are downed, and so on. EU troops would respond if they are fired upon, as that's why they are there. Even UN peacekeepers have been known to fire back occasionally. And it all might seriously escalate from there, with the US saying, "Hey, we told you we won't get involved. Your troops are not on NATO soil, Articles 5 and 6 don't apply, and you are on your own." The EU force might then have to decide whether to back down or to actually keep fighting the Russians. Since the NATO treaty wording is vague, the US could even say that if EU tries to use their own bases in EU countries to launch counterattacks on Russia, that the US would not protect them from any possible Russian counterattacks on those bases, even if they are in NATO's lands. So EU forces might then have to channel all their might through Ukraine. But that's just one problem. The other two are, does the EU have the power to fight Russia and Ukraine? And is the EU united enough to even go do it? That second variable very much impacts the first. For example, if just half the EU countries are willing to fight in Ukraine, then of course the overall power levels available to EU forces against Russia get halved. Everything said so far might seem far-fetched, but it's a scenario that any EU army might actually face. So how strong could an EU army be? Does it really need US military power? The EU currently doesn't have its own army. Nationalistic divisions still exist, and each country plans defense by itself. You can explore how that feels yourself by playing Conflict of Nations, a free online PvP grand strategy sponsoring this video. In it, you choose a real modern country to lead during World War III. I'm playing as Spain in Flashpoint, a special Europe-focused game mode. But in world map modes, you can play against 100 or more real players, each leading their own country. Conflict of Nations is a real-time strategy with a very methodical approach. Matches can take weeks to complete. I usually play on my desktop at work and continue the match on my phone when home. I'll tell you more about how you can support Binkov directly through the game after our video, but for now know that Binkov viewers get a special gift. Click on the link in the description to create an account. You'll get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Choose your country and conquer the world. It all depends on the cause. Is the peacekeeping force in Ukraine there just to sit near the front line? Or is it a force with a mission to do counterstrikes, even strikes at Russian bases if those bases are used to strike at the peacekeepers? Or is it a force that's a replacement for NATO, ready to defend Poland, Finland, and the Baltics if those are suddenly attacked by Russia? Each of those three situations would see different levels of unity within the EU. We can only assume that the NATO replacement EU army for defense only might entail all the EU members. We can't know if some countries would try to squeeze by with sending minimal forces. But for other missions, we're best to look at Ukraine peacekeeping commitments as a show of unity in the EU. There is little desire for a large peacekeeping force to be sent to Ukraine. So far, the bravest words have come from a non-EU member, Britain. Germany and Poland have quite clearly said they would not send peacekeepers. Portugal and Bulgaria also said no. France was flip-floppy, one moment signaling it would send forces, the next saying it's not considering it. But after the Zelensky-Trump meeting, France is more firmly in the yes camp. The Italian Prime Minister most recently said she refused the newest Franco-British coalition of the willing, so we will count Italy as a no. Spain was undecided, but most recently its Prime Minister said that if a peace deal is working, they would have no problem sending troops. The Dutch Prime Minister had said no, but the Dutch Parliament passed a resolution okaying a possible deployment if a peace deal is reached and if the government changes its mind. Sweden and Finland have not ruled out the possibility of sending troops. Belgium's stance is even more positive, as they're open to the idea. Romania has been mum on the issue. Greece is, in Binkov's opinion, very unlikely to participate, even though officially they haven't said anything in this latest round of geopolitical posturing. During 2024, Greece was vocal about not sending its troops, nor did it ever send too much hardware to Ukraine. There are other countries in Europe, of course, but we can't list them all. Smaller countries would have negligible impact on the overall capabilities of an EU army. But we already know that Hungary or Slovakia aren't gonna budge, for as long as their current leadership is in power. Czechia too seems unlikely, as the September elections seem set to give a lot of power to Babis, whose party is unlikely to participate in such a mission. Of course, countries' positions tend to change over time, and a different composition of the coalition of the willing might happen. The point of our example is to show just one plausible composition. So an EU army doesn't exist yet. And the reason it doesn't exist is precisely because of a lack of common goal and common policies. Sure, against an attack on the EU itself, unity would be greater, but armies are not always used for defense only. Right now, it appears that if an Ukrainian mission is considered, countries with less than half of the EU's military might actually go for it. Mind you, that doesn't mean all their militaries would go into Ukraine. In fact, only a fraction of their forces might go. But overall militaries of those countries should be more inclined to escalate with Russia, if needed. Some countries are simply too small for their contribution to count. Even the three Baltic states, counted together, are unlikely to contribute much to an EU army, as they are right at Russia's doorstep. Most of their military would remain to protect their border. So even if we count in all the countries listed as leaning yes, plus let's say Romania, plus even Netherlands, which are more leaning towards no, and if we disregard the countries too small to contribute much, an EU army formed of 100% of those countries' troops would be pretty limited. To be more precise, all those countries combined have a total active military personnel of exactly 500,000 troops. Of course, that includes everything from administration, joint command, navy, air force, and so on. Total active army personnel count for said countries is just over 280,000. Even out of those, actual maneuver units such as brigades and independent battalions comprise maybe half of said number. That number is what could be, roughly speaking, compared with 500 to 700,000 Russian troops inside Ukraine, often mentioned for the second half of 2024. The lower figure should be a decent estimate of Russian maneuver unit troops. Also for comparison, some 300 to 400,000 Ukrainian maneuver troops should be available at the front lines. Now clearly this is just an academic discussion, as when it comes to a peacekeeping force, we know said force would be far smaller, at a few tens of thousands, and include troops from UK and other countries. If there is ever a situation where fighting between the select few EU peacekeepers and Russian troops escalates, it's hard to imagine that the selected EU countries would go all in, all on their own. But for argument's sake, how much hardware does the aforementioned selection of certain EU countries have compared to Russia? They have 1,200 tanks, most of them fairly modern, as well as 2,700 various infantry fighting vehicles, recon and assault armored vehicles, not counting armored personnel carriers. Russia currently has around 2,900 tanks and 4,000 other IFVs and recon vehicles in active service. Selected EU countries have 2,100 artillery pieces, counting 105mm and over, but not counting mortars. That compares half decently with Russia's 3,900 artillery pieces. But majority of European pieces are either Romanian near-obsolete equipment or Finland's stored guns for their reservists. Given that Finland, like all the other countries, would realistically send just the active component and not reservists, only a fraction of the Finnish total of both tanks and guns would in reality be present. Finland is an extreme example, very much focusing its military on reservists. Other countries should be able to send most of their hardware with the active duty troops, should they choose to do so. Combined air forces of the selected EU countries are quite potent at some 730 combat aircraft. Russia, not counting bombers, has some 980, but a smaller proportion of the Russian fleet are fighters and multi-role jets. Plus the European fleet is a bit more modern and capable on average. So the EU army made up of selected countries could actually be stronger in the air. Counting in the EU's edge in AWACS-like planes, Russia would be unlikely to be able to do much offensively, though with Russia's ample SAM defenses, this Europe's air forces would also be unlikely to prevail in offensive operations. Attack helicopter tally would be clearly in Russian favor. Ukrainian forces were hardly mentioned so far, and they could add some serious firepower and numbers, which is why any EU army sent to Ukraine would not really be that huge. It's hard to speculate on an EU army when there is no clear mission, need, or even political consensus between EU countries. Russia could definitely be seen as a threat. Most EU countries would agree on that. But other than deterring Russia, there may be no other real purpose for an EU army. A minority of EU countries like France and Netherlands have overseas territories and faraway interests, so it's extremely unlikely a broader EU army would go defending such faraway interests. We've already seen that France on its own has mostly come to terms that its interests and influence across Africa are getting smaller and smaller. China is far, far away and may or may not use military power on Taiwan, far from EU interests. If the EU is having so much trouble assembling a union-spanning force to serve as peacekeepers in nearby Ukraine, just imagine the lack of willingness to send troops to fight China directly halfway across the world. There wouldn't be any. Spain has some territories near Morocco, but it's unlikely Morocco would do much about it. Turkey too has been pretty quiet about Cyprus for a long time now. Heck, the US might be perceived as a greater military threat than all those, if the US ever tries to take control of Greenland. In such a geopolitical landscape, Russia is the sole real potential threat. And Russia, despite its recently increased military spending and an economy on a war footing, is fairly exhausted by the war in Ukraine, much more than EU countries sending aid to Ukraine are. Of course, realistically, there is NATO for just such a scenario. Recently, however, the US has been more preoccupied with China. But if we imagine for a moment that NATO dissolves, and if we imagine the EU is on its own to defend, say, Baltic states against a hypothetical Russian attack, what would the balance of power be? Taking the entire combined military forces of the EU this time, it's visible that for as long as the EU remains unified, Russia would hold less troops and equipment. Russia has fewer active-duty military personnel, fewer active-duty army troops, and far fewer organized and trained reserve troops. Of course, lots of Russian soldiers have by now been battle-hardened and are more experienced. That matters to a degree, but in a modern war where standoff sensors and munitions reign supreme, experience may not be as important as it was, say, in World War II. The EU has more tanks and better tanks in active service, though fewer tanks in storage, as well as almost double the number of various armored combat vehicles that aren't APCs. Unified EU is ahead of Russia even when it comes to artillery pieces. Again, there are many caveats here, Russians being more experienced and their MRLs largely being of longer reach. Plus, Russia has far more tactical missiles, such as Iskanders, compared to European stock of ATACMS missiles. While production of larger cruise missiles is limited to small-scale deliveries in France, Russia is currently producing around 1,200 large cruise missiles per year. So unless Ukraine war ties down a lot of Russian ammunition, Russia could have far more standoff missiles to use on the EU. That being said, direct usefulness of such missiles is often overstated. Spending thousands and thousands of such missiles in Ukraine still hasn't given Russia a decisive edge, with the EU being a much bigger target set. That's partly also why the Russian edge in artillery shell production wouldn't really be decisive. The Russian figure that's shown is imprecise, as it's unknown how many shells are newly made and how many are refurbished. Russia likely also has an edge in mass-produced small-size recon drones, as well as first-person view kamikaze drones, and other guided munitions like the Lancet. Plus, Russian drone and missile operators are likely much more experienced. While the EU likely has the potential to eventually outproduce Russia in a protracted war due to its much bigger economy and bigger industry, in the short term, like over a year or two, Russia would likely keep outproducing the EU when it comes to both guided and unguided munitions. The EU does have almost more than double the number of fighter jets and 50% more combat planes overall, and they're more capable overall. So quite a bit of that drone recon edge Russia has would be blunted. Both sides have ample air defenses, so it would be hard for any side to really exploit the benefits a strong air force brings. In a way, the EU would have to lean a bit more on classic air force power projection, while Russia would be leaning more on cheap drones. So, once again, does a hypothetical EU army need the US military help? It really depends. For most situations, no. It could use it in Ukraine, though. Due to the lack of EU's unity, the US edge might really make a difference there, if the US decides to go into Ukraine. The US could add quite a bit more firepower, especially when its National Guard is included. While it is a reservist formation, it receives more training and better equipment than most such formations. The US adds roughly as many tanks and other combat vehicles as Russia itself, generally of greater capability. It adds close to a similar number of artillery pieces. It also adds 3 times as many planes as Russia has, of much better quality and with ample other support planes. And even in SAMs it levels out the playing field, while in attack helicopters it almost doubles the Russian figure. So yes, the EU army could definitely use even just parts of the US force as an addition. But if we're not talking about troops in Ukraine, and if we are talking about a unified Europe, like due to a Russian attack, current EU forces should be enough. The unity is key there, which in a hypothetical situation of Russia attacking out of the blue should be there. A bigger problem is if there's a limited Russian incursion, especially one without much warning. For example, Russia taking just the 3 Baltic states. The geography is such that the EU simply could not react in time, and by the time a whole EU force is assembled, it might be very hard to push Russia out of the Baltics. However, Russia would then likely lose its Kaliningrad region in return, in fights with Polish EU forces. Furthermore, available Russian forces are not really a given. If the war in Ukraine still goes on, half the Russian Air Force and most of the army would be tied down there. Even if Russia goes on pure defense in Ukraine, it would still likely have a few 100,000 troops tied down. Even if there's a peace deal in Ukraine, with Russia later attacking the Baltics and EU going to war with Russia, it's likely Ukraine would join the fray once more. And Russia's big nuclear arsenal complicates all this greatly. Again, it's impossible to model hypothetical future situations with so many variables. US forces are so big and capable that they are always a welcome addition, but even they could not prevent Baltics being taken in a surprise attack, unless enough forces are stationed in the Baltics before a surprise attack. We are talking about 100 or 200,000 troops. Realistically, that won't be done anytime soon. Without a multi-year war requiring a war economy, it's possible the EU army alone could not take back the Baltic states. So, verdict? Today's EU forces don't desperately need the US military, but it would sure come in handy to lower the overall casualties. Conflict of Nations fans, listen up. Once you're in game, you can support Binkov directly. If you're purchasing anything through the in-game webshop, a small part of your payment will go towards supporting my channel. You just need to enter the code Binkov during the checkout process. I often go for a month of premium account when I play. It just streamlines the game, adds rally points, building queues and other perks. Conflict of Nations is all about strategy and management. I need to manage provinces and their morale. I need to scour the markets for resources and trade them. That's a good way to find allies too. Spain is a good starting position, but without allies, it's gonna be an uphill battle. There are hundreds of technologies to research and the game offers well over 100 units. Cruise missiles, drones, tanks, AWACS planes, SAMs and even nuclear weapons, they're all here in-game. Remember, click on the link in the description if you want to create an account and try it out. You'll get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. That offer is available for 30 days only, so don't lose time. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.